Thank you for joining us on Cloudy with a Chance of Podcast. I'm Chief Meteorologist McCall Vrydaghs, joined by Meteorologist Kirstie Zontini, my co-host, and we are very excited about today's episode. Kirstie and I have been talking about it ever since we had this special guest agree to be on the podcast today, and we don't want to waste any time talking about nonsense. We want to get right to this episode. So Kirstie, I'm going to let you just take it away and introduce our guest today.
All right. Thank you so much, McCall. Yeah, so we're very excited. McCall and I both have said this is a man who is definitely a legend in the meteorological community. So thank you so much, Dr. Sheperd, for joining. About Dr. Sheperd, he is an expert in weather and climate. He has a PhD in physical meteorology. His Georgia Athletic Association's distinguished professor of geography and atmospheric sciences. In 2013, he was the president of the American Meteorological Society. He's a scientist. He's a professor. He's a member of the National Academy of Engineering. He also hosts a podcast and a television host, and he is a senior Forbes contributor, which Dr. Sheperd, I love your Forbes articles. I read them all the time. So thank you so much for joining us. And our special connection to Dr. Sheperd is actually our newest meteorologist, Chaney, who we've had on the team, who was your student, correct?
Absolutely. And one of our best students ever, might I add, at the University of Georgia in atmospheric sciences. So congratulations to you all for having him. I think your listeners and viewers are going to really like him and see why I say what I say about him.
Well, I do remember Austin saying that when he started college, he wasn't so sure if he was going to get into meteorology. And I believe he said he had maybe one conversation with you and then realized that was the path that he wanted to take.
Yeah, he certainly is someone that, he dabbled with meteorology, had a fairly legendary following, even as a young man in high school, even some of his social media presence. But, weather enthusiasm doesn't necessarily always translate to meteorology and atmospheric sciences degrees. I have a lot of students come through my office say, hey, I love clouds, I love chasing, I love hurricanes, I want to be a meteorologist. And unfortunately, sometimes I'll have to start that conversation as that's good, but do you like partial differential equations, calculus, and physics? Because you certainly know that meteorology is quite a bit of physics and fluid dynamics and so forth, but he mastered all of that and he's doing well. I'm so proud of him.
That's wonderful. Well, Dr. Sheperd, let's talk a little bit more about you. Obviously, our introduction was very brief. We will have a full list of your accolades because, it is impressive. But we ask our guests a little bit about their path to meteorology or whatever their career field. Obviously, for you, Dr. Sheperd, what was your path like?
My path started with a honeybee. And I'll explain that shortly. I used to catch bees in the yard when I was a kid, and I wanted to be an entomologist, studying insects. But then I got stung by a honeybee, and I found out I was highly allergic to bee stings. And this is before everyone carried EpiPens, by the way.
Wow.
And so sixth grade science project rolled around. I said, well, I need a plan B, pun intended, because I couldn't do a bee science project. So I started a project about weather. And I built weather instruments from things around the house. I developed a little weather model for my community. And I won the science fair, and I was bitten by the weather bug from that point on. But unlike the outstanding work that you do, I didn't want to kind of go into the broadcast meteorology side of the house. I was more interested in the research and development side of the house, and the R&D side. So even as a middle schooler, I started researching, okay, who has really good meteorology departments? And being from Georgia, we didn't have anything at University of Georgia or Georgia Tech at the undergraduate level at that time, but Florida State was close by, relatively speaking, really good program. And so that's how I ended up at Florida State, majoring in meteorology, ended up getting a master's degree, worked for NASA for a little while, went back and got my PhD, and then resumed my career at NASA. And so it literally started with that honeybee sting.
That's amazing.
I mean, everybody has their own little path. And I just love that it was such what would seem like an insignificant thing in anybody's life would be such a pivotal moment in your life, in your career, and who you are now. As a professor, is there something that sticks out to you that, as far as giving all this information to new kids and seeing them prosper and being the pivotal moment in their life, is there anything that sticks out in your mind?
Well, it's so important what you all do as broadcast meteorologists, because you are the scientists that people see on a day-to-day basis. They don't see me. They don't talk to people in labs. the main scientist that the general public is exposed to every day on a daily basis is their broadcast meteorologist. So first of all, I want to commend both of you for what you do. And I tell my students that as well. You're scientists. Now, all of you won't go into broadcast meteorology. In fact, you mentioned I was the former president of the American Meteorological Society. By our own data, only about 8 to 10% of meteorologists or TV meteorologists do what you two do. Most meteorologists and climate scientists and atmospheric scientists work in other fields for government agencies, private firms. If you're flying Delta Airlines, for example, anywhere around the country or the world, one of my students is helping you because she's a meteorologist with Delta Airlines, for example. And so the message that I convey to students now is to embrace the science, stand by and affirm the science, but also understand that opportunities for you lie well beyond sort of what you may see as the traditional career pathways, because weather, unlike almost any other science, as you all well know, touches basically every part of our lives, from the food that we eat to our transportation, infrastructure, public health. And so there are job opportunities and career opportunities that span all of these professions because of that.
I think that is a really great message, Dr. Sheperd, and something that McCall and I, as this podcast has progressed, we have realized just obviously weather touches so many people. So we have people on, there's always some weather angle or climate angle to a guest that we talk about. But, we have a meteorologist who works for an insurance company who was on with us, even just talking with COVID, talking to, epidemiologists about how weather was impacting the virus when this first was coming out. So I really appreciate you touching on that, because I do think it's so important that, yes, you may see your TV meteorologists, in the morning and evening, but the career and the opportunity, and especially now with our changing climate, more and more companies and businesses are relying on kind of getting that modeling and getting that information of how it's even going to impact, how toilet paper your bathroom,
Yeah, I want to, I was on Twitter. By the way, I'm at Dr. Sheperd 2013 if you want to follow me on Twitter, because I keep it on and popping on Twitter. I like to engage.
Yes, you do.
And so, happy to have you join me and follow. But, I was talking to someone on Twitter the other day. We were like, yeah, meteorology and weather forecasting, it's an art. And there is art involved and experience, but it's a science too. We are modeling a physical fluid in the atmosphere using complex equations. So I push back a little bit, because I think there's this notion, we're kind of like, let's see, yeah, we're going to have rain in 2 days. No, it's a real science. And we've made quite a bit of progress. We always hear, and you all hear it too, this joke, oh, you must be nice to get paid to be wrong half the time. Meteorologists, we're actually right 95% of the time. People just tend to remember the occasional bad forecast of the one that affected them. It's just like a football player. I mean, I know you're in Ohio. I don't know if you're in the Bengals market or the Browns market. Well,
it's split.
It's split. I thought it would be. Yeah. So if the Bengals or the Browns field goal kicker makes every field goal every game all year long, he's a really good field goal kicker. But if this is the one in the Super Bowl that cost them the game, that's the one they're going to be talking about. And that's what we deal with in meteorology and weather forecast as well. A lot of misperceptions out there. People now look at that little smiling sun that has a little grin on it on their app. Yes, that's telling me everything that's going to happen for 24 hours in one icon. It's not actually. And so we have to understand that there are things in the way we communicate. And that's why people like you always be around, because people want to hear from a human and trusted voice, especially during times of hazardous and severe weather.
Yeah, I think that especially over the past decade, I would say I've learned, Kirstie has learned, there's a lot of psychology that comes into play when you're talking about weather, and how people react and interpret what you say. So especially for us in the Miami Valley, winter storms tend to have a big psychological impact on people. They want to know 5 days out what's going to happen, where in severe weather season, people understand that the weather can change in a minute, but it's all weather. So it's just interesting when you are telling a forecast and things like that. I do want to pivot a little bit here, because you are a research and development person, and climate change is something that we are actively researching. And you are a big advocate as to talking about it, not only in your articles, but pretty much everywhere. Can you talk a little bit about climate change and how the message really just needs to get out there for people to educate themselves?
Well, first of all, let me thank you, McCall and Kirstie, Thank you, thank you, thank you for even broaching the subject. Because let's keep it real. There are colleagues within our field and colleagues in what you do that are a little hesitant to even mention the word. But in fact, it's not political. It's not a dirty word. Hurricane storm surge or ice sheets melting don't care whether we're Republicans or Democrats or blue or red. They just do what they do and impact our lives. And so I think we are now starting to see a shift in the sort of narrative about climate change because, first of all, the science is clear and has been clear. Climate is changing. Yes, we know it changes naturally. I get that. I could be walking in the mall and someone finds out what I do. And then, well, Dr. Sheperd, the climate changes naturally. We always have had hurricanes.
Yeah.
It's like, I promise you I didn't miss that in my grad school at Florida. But like a baseball player, like one of those Cincinnati Reds or those, Cleveland, what is it now? They changed the name to? It's not the Indians anymore, but they changed
Guardians.
The Guardians.
I always think Guardians of the Galaxy for some reason. But anyhow, when those baseball players were, in those eras of steroids, they hit home runs naturally too, right? But in the performance enhancing drug era, they were hitting longer ones and more of them. Look, grass grows naturally, but when we fertilize the soil, it grows differently. So there is nothing that says natural processes don't have human impacts on top of them. And that's what we're seeing with climate. And it's not about a polar bear or the year 2100. It's about the food that we eat, public health, transportation costs, our economy, national security. These are all what I call kitchen table issues that affect Ohioans right now. And so we have to, and I think we have started to move away from this political narrative. You've got people on both sides of the political spectrum that are now talking about the solutions, adaptation, mitigation. Some even talk about geoengineering. I don't want to go there just yet. But mitigation, reducing carbon emissions, or adaptation. Okay, certain things are going to happen. Let's adjust. And so we're starting to see more of those conversations now. We've kind of moved away from the is it happening or not conversation.
I agree. And I think it's part of the messaging. I think just the difference in the phrasing of global warming and climate change, when you have the word warming, people are like, well, it's colder, it's snowing more. This is a lie. This is a sham. But using the wording climate change, if you were to ask anybody, is it getting hotter? They'll tell you, yeah, especially where we live, farming, we're having more droughts and it's hotter and their crops are struggling, or we have a ton of rain. I believe that the education and people are just now like, oh yeah, it's definitely changing. And I think that's making it easier for people like Kirstie and I in our position to be able to have that conversation. And to be quite frank, 2 years ago, this conversation would give me sweaty armpits. Like I would just not be okay with having it. But we're at a point now that it's changing.
Oh, it's certainly changing. And people, I've always thought that the narrative on just focusing on average change in temperature was confusing people because that's the least of my concerns. Look, when we get the flu or COVID, a fever is just one of the symptoms of the flu.
Right.
The warming is just one aspect of the changing climate. Sea level rise, more intense hurricanes, more when I mean greater intensity. It's not necessarily more in terms of the number. Frequency and variability of drought. These are all things that are affecting people. And so the fever, in the same way that starts to affect our bodies and starts to impact other parts of our body systems, that warming starts to affect other parts of the Earth's climate system. And then we see the impacts that affect our lives, farmers in that area. I mean, again, there's still people that will, I don't know about that climate change stuff, but you know what? When I go to a farmer that I think knows that, I don't even bring up the words climate change or the CO2 lines. I said, well, what are you seeing on your farm? Are you seeing more variability, more drought? I mean, you tell me what you're seeing. And they usually tell me things that I know from a science perspective are indicative of climate change.
Yeah.
But if he or she doesn't want to call it that, fine. But that's what's happening. And so we have to deal with it.
I have a question too, and kind of just your perspective as well. Obviously, like you said, the warming is one aspect, but even in the Miami Valley, something that we have seen is an intensity in the frequency and really the intensity of rain. So we'll get thunderstorms now that will flood out some of our urban communities that not necessarily were people that aren't living in a floodplain. They're not living near the Great Miami River, but we'll get storms now that can hold more moisture and can dump a lot more rain, and there's more frequency to it. So I guess for people that maybe aren't in the farming community and are just living in cities like Dayton or Cincinnati or some other big cities, urban communities, what's, I guess, like an easy way or some examples that you can give then for perspective? Because I think sometimes people kind of want to just say, well, I'm not a farmer.
Yeah, that you're hitting on a really important point here. First of all, as you noted, because of this really fancy physics relationship called the Clausius-Clapeyron equation, test Austin on that when you guys get in.
I will.
See if he remembers. But the Clausius-Clapeyron relationship tells us that as our climate system warms, it has the capacity to hold water vapor, and you have increased evaporative rates and so forth. So you've got more water vapor available for those thunderstorms. So the data is very clear. It's in the scientific literature. When we get intense rains, it's raining with much more intensity than it did 50 years ago. Here's the problem for urban areas. We know from a science perspective that the intensity of rain, on average, when it's raining hard, that rainstorm is raining at a greater intensity than it did in 1970 on average. Here's the problem. The stormwater management and engineering of Dayton, Cincinnati, Atlanta, Miami are engineered for the 1960s and 70s rainstorms. They were engineered on something called stationarity, which is a fancy term that means when the engineers are designing those stormwater runoff and management, it was assuming that the rain in 1950 would be just like the rain in 2021, and it's not. And so those systems are being overwhelmed. The other thing that's important to note about that, we all go to Target and the mall and Best Buy and Walmart. There's a lot more impervious surfaces, pavements around. So that alters the natural water cycle. So when that rain comes down, it normally would infiltrate into the soil, but now it runs off rapidly in those parking lots into the streams and rivers. They fill up, and you dump this intense rain on top and you get urban flooding. And so that's what's going on. And then the last point I want to make about the urban environment, we know that global warming is happening in a broad sense, but people that live in urban environments like Dayton, Cincinnati, Cleveland, and so forth, live in an urban heat island too. Mm-hmm. So you have the urban heat island warmth because of all the pavement and lack of trees on top of this broader climate change. So there are quite a few vulnerabilities in urban areas.
Now, I know that when some people do push back, they think that we're kind of like in a panic mode, right? Why is it such a big deal? And it's because we have the information. We realize how severe this is and what a critical point we are at in this moment of climate change. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, because I'm a scientist. By our very nature, believe it or not, scientists tend to be more conservative and objective about things. We don't want to seem like we're being hyperbolic or exaggerating things. That's been the problem. The problem is these things that we saw that were going to happen 30, 40 years ago that are now happening with greater intensity and frequency than even we expected. Mm-hmm. I mean, in other words, the sea level rise that we see now, or the melting Arctic sea ice and so forth, the intensity and rapid intensification of hurricanes like Michael, for example, and Dorian and so forth. These things are happening as expected, and in some cases, even more so. But because we're scientists, we try to be very staid and very stately and publish in our journals and go to our AMS conferences. And we don't want to be exaggerated because we have scientific reputations to uphold. So what I'm saying is, to your point, McCall, we actually should have been sounding the alarm with even more vigor than we have. And I think it's because of our nature as scientists, we probably haven't. So I think we've, for a long time, we were like, well, we may see this and there's uncertainty here and there's and so I think that confuses the public because so uncertainty is one of the nastiest words in science. We have to use it when we talk about uncertainty, but when the public hears the word uncertainty, they think it means we don't know. But in science, when we use the word uncertainty, it just means there's sort of some precision or error. So for example, when either of you go on the air and say there's an 80% chance of rain, I bet your viewers and listeners are going to take an umbrella that day. Yeah. But behold, there was uncertainty in that information.
Right.
There was 20% uncertainty. So, but there was enough usable information. So we just, again, I think one of you made a point about messaging. I think we've gotten better at messaging. And if you want some insight on my thoughts, because we don't have time today, I wrote a Forbes article called The 9 Tips for Communicating Science to People Who Aren't Scientists. And in that article in Forbes, I lay out some tricks of the trade that I use when I'm trying to communicate to broader audiences on climate.
And I think that it's important. Yeah, we'll definitely put that in our article when we post this online. I think it's important to note that anybody that's watching or listening, I know that sometimes people get stuck on one narrative. So say you live in the middle of the country and you hear, oh, rapid intensification of hurricanes, that's not going to impact me. Well, that might not impact you, but the intensity of rain might impact you. You live in Seattle, you just had triple-digit temperatures. The infrastructure there to be able to cool people, they don't have as many air conditioning, central air buildings. You're going to have more heat related deaths. So it may not necessarily be one thing, but another might be impactful for where you live.
That's a great point.
Moving forward, what, if any, type of projects are you working on now?
Yeah, that's a great question, because when people hear that I'm a professor at the University of Georgia, when I tell people I'm a professor, the first question I usually get is, what do you teach? Because I think most people perceive their professors as being teachers, when in fact, it's not like a high school teacher or middle school. We don't actually teach as many classes as you do. We have at major universities like I'm at, Research One level universities. So I have multi-million-dollar research projects with NASA, U.S. Forest Service, National Science Foundation. So some of my current ongoing research is involving looking at something called the brown ocean effect, which my group came forward with that in a paper in 2013, this idea that some hurricanes and tropical cyclones, when they move on land, they're supposed to weaken. But sometimes if there's previous week's rainfall and soil is very moist, they can maintain their intensity and in fact, even strengthen. So we've got some NASA funding to look at that problem. We have some ongoing projects looking at how urban environments affect storms, rainfall, and land surface flooding that we were talking about earlier. We've got a project going on looking at climate risk and vulnerability, looking at how we draw down carbon emissions, something called Drawdown Georgia, which is a project that I'm involved in. We've had projects recently looking at water and precipitation availability in the desert Southwest on native lands and so forth. So, the beautiful thing about being a professor is, I started with a science project in 6th grade. I basically get paid money now to do big science projects on much larger scales than making little weather instruments. But, and then I get to teach that and share it with students and have graduate students that study under me and so forth. So literally, I'm a kid in a candy store. And if anyone knows me, and Austin Chaney knows this well, I don't feel like I work. I mean, I have fun at the University of Georgia. I host Weather Geeks for the Weather Channel. I write for I do all kinds of things, and it's literally as fun as it was when I was in 6th grade.
Well, I've got one more question, McCall. Hopefully we have time for it. And this is just because sometimes when people do hear our discussions about climate change and it is scary, and it can be scary, and you should be like, okay, we need to take action. Can you give us maybe some action that people can take, positivity? What is something that if you're just a weather enthusiast, which we do have just people that love weather that listen to our podcast that aren't fellow meteorologists,
sure.
What's a takeaway that they can have that maybe can help give them some hope?
Yeah, well, no, I'm optimistic. I actually am not this doom and gloom type person. I know we need to take action on things, but I'm optimistic about the fact that we're seeing faith-based organizations, the military, political perspectives on both sides of the ledger starting to talk and act on this. So if you're listening, no matter what you believe politically, that has nothing to do with the fact that climate is changing. So understand that. Go to climate.gov. That's a really good website that NOAA has, that you can get the basics unfiltered by political bias and so forth on what's going on. Make sure you are aware of that when you're thinking about your elected officials, hold them accountable on either side of the ledger on this topic. And also, there's a really good book that I would recommend called called Drawdown. I'm sorry. And it just talks about the 100 solutions, and not all of them will be relevant to you in Dayton or wherever you are. But there are things you can do, from simple composting, which I started doing during the COVID lockdown.
Nice.
to larger scale actions involving how we build buildings and types of cars we drive that can help us mitigate or reduce carbon emissions, which is ultimately the goal. So things like even just, eating less meat. I still eat meat, but I do try to eat one less day of meat because meat production, livestock production is very carbon intensive. So there are all kinds of solutions out there. And just follow me on Twitter, because I'm always giving things out there that are good advice on how you can think about some of these issues. And I even though I said earlier, I keep it on and popping in a positive way. I try to provide information that's credible and defensible.
And I will say your articles are very easy to read. They're not, you would think a professor's article in Forbes might be really hard to get through. But I think just the average person, if you're interested in this type of topic, you write a lot about it.
Yes,
that your articles are very easy to read, and you're always posting them on your Twitter. So why don't you give your Twitter handle again?
Yeah. And I because I write them as if I'm writing them for my wife, who's a very intelligent person, but not a scientist. So and it's at Dr. Sheperd 2013. Doctor is with the DR, and Sheperd is like shepherd if you were tending sheep. So at Dr. Sheperd 2013. I'm also on Instagram at Marsh or FSU. But that's really if you want to follow my daughter who plays club volleyball and my basketball son and all that kind of stuff, but occasionally some science there as well.
Well, Dr. Sheperd, this has been fantastic. Kirstie, I don't know if you have any other final questions.
No, I absolutely loved being able to talk to you in real life, because it is funny. I've followed you on Twitter for a while now. And so it's funny to hear you actually speak, where you can kind of feel like you hear you through your Twitter feed. Does that make sense?
Well, I was going to say, I hope that you can see some of the same personalities in my Twitter feed, because, I try to build myself as the anti-academic. So academic ivory tower people can be really stuffy and very, I just am a person that loves science, loves to go to baseball and basketball games, college football, music. And so I'm pretty regular and normal. So I try to convey that in being a scientist as well.
Well, thanks as always, Dr. Sheperd, for being on our podcast. Hopefully we can have you on another time. This was a great episode. I'm sure we can figure out another topic to talk about.
I've got plenty of them.
Excellent. And for all of our watchers and listeners, thank you for listening to Cloudy with a Chance of Podcast. You can download, subscribe on any podcast app that you have, whether it's Android or iPhone. You can also watch the video version on WHIO.com. We'll post it to our social accounts. And if you have a Roku, Amazon Fire, or Apple TV, download the WHIO app there, and we will have the video version as well. As always, thank you for joining us here on Cloudy with a Chance of Podcast.